We now start the last lecture for today, and this lecture is dedicated to yet other two systems called Ripple and Corda. And again, there is very little in common between the two systems, just package them in a single lecture. So what are Ripple and Corda? Okay. Okay. So Ripple is one of the earliest cryptocurrencies, and today it's number 4 by the market cap. But it was number 2 by popularity before Ethereum was launched after Bitcoin. Well, Corda is, I already mentioned Corda in the lecture on Hyperledger. Corda supports a totally different paradigm related to blockchain. And it's intended for developing blockchain application, doesn't even have its own token. So let's talk about Ripple first. In Ripple, again, there are different roles for nodes. There are users doing financial transactions. There are market makers, and the market makers is essentially a credit network of trusted banks and subsidiaries taking responsibilities for transactions. So please note, it's totally different from everything we've seen before. They said no centralized control. Well, and usually banks compete with cryptocurrencies. In Ripple, banks participate in the system. So it's a credit network of trusted banks and subsidiaries. And then we have validating servers, which are running consensus on the ledger. And the system is permissioned and tightly controlled. So Ripple is an interesting case in which the ledger is open for everyone to see, but there is a small subset of validating servers which are responsible for running consensus and extending the ledger. So how does it work with respect to the peer-to-peer network of market makers? So you can see here that there are two users, A and B, and the user wants to transfer, say, $100. User A wants to transfer $100 to B. So the idea is this payment, but how is it implemented? There is a need to find the routing path of financial institutions which are willing to route the transaction. And as a matter of fact, this is what happens when you say transfer funds like long distances. If you transfer funds, say, from some small bank in India to a small bank in say, Brazil or Norway, like the other part of the globe, what happens is that the transfer is not direct. So usually, like the small bank would send the money to a larger bank, and the larger bank would connect to a network, and then it would reach the main bank of Norway, and from the main bank of Norway, it will go to the small bank where the account is registered. So this is what happens today. But of course, what happens today, like this path, is opaque. It's not visible to the users. When I make a transfer, I don't know the path that the money takes. I only know the end result of the transfer. In Ripple, you get to see the entire path of financial institutions which are willing to route the funds. And not only this, the path is calculated by the system. So it can be dynamic and adaptable. There is also another interesting aspect. They can transfer, for example, they can transfer dollars, not the Ripple currency. Of course, like, it's simplified if they're transferring Ripple currency, because then we can check the accounts. But they can also transfer dollars, or they can transfer bitcoins using Ripple. How? This is the example with dollars. So they introduced the concept of IOU transactions. So what happens is that every financial institution has a trust, has a like limit of trust towards every user and every other financial institution. So you can see here, institution U1 has trust of up to $250 for A. So as long as A transfers a smaller amount of funds, or wants to transfer, it's okay. And then U2 has a trust of up to $130 towards U1. So, okay, so what happens when A transfers the funds? This amount is, it's like a credit, right? So this amount is deducted from the credit amount. And this happens on every step in the path, which needs to be coordinated. And by the way, the selection of the path needs to take the credit frame into account. For example, here you see the trust is $90. So it's impossible to use this path in order to transfer $100. So the calculation of the path is one interesting aspect of Ripple. But at the end, it allows Ripple to act as a bridge between currencies. So we were talking about interoperability of currencies in one of the lectures. So Ripple was the very first bridge. Today we have many more, but Ripple was the first one. And it's still functioning as a bridge. Now, okay, so that was the peer-to-peer peer-to-peer architecture of Ripple. But Ripple also has consensus, like a small number of servers performing the consensus. Well, small number. Small number means up to 100, not up to thousands. Still, so 100 is not such a small number. How do they do that? All validating servers execute 3 asynchronous phases: collection of transaction, consensus on transaction, and ledger closure. During the collection phase, the servers collect new transactions from the network, and each server verifies every transaction, including the routing paths. And then, towards the end of the phase, the server constructs a proposal that includes every verified transaction received during the collection phase. Now, during the consensus phase, proposals are continually exchanged, and what's interesting is that during the consensus phase, new transactions are still arriving. So, at the end of collection phase, it's just the first proposal is being formed, but those proposals, they're being extended all the time because new transactions are arriving, even during the consensus phase. And what's interesting is that even though proposal is like is for a batch of transaction, but the voting on every transaction counts individually, right? So if a proposal includes a transaction, this counts as a vote for that transaction. So the votes for each transaction are counted separately. And when the transaction receives votes from 80% of the servers, it becomes confirmed. And once Uh, all of the transaction, or each transaction in the proposal gets confirmed by 80% of the servers. We start the third phase, which is ledger closure. And the closure procedure produces a new ledger. So it's different, again, from Bitcoin or Ethereum. In Bitcoin or Ethereum, we have a single chain of blocks, right? In Ripple, instead, there is a chain of ledgers. And each ledger would include many transactions. And then, like, the whole thing works in a loop. The 3 phases, right? After the previous ledger is closed, we start the new collection phase. So the duration, of course, of the collection phase is something that's very important for Ripple, because if the collection phase is too long, then it takes too much time to confirm transactions. But if it's too short, then each ledger will end up with many ledgers and many small ledgers. And that is not good for performance. So how does it perform in practice? Most ledgers are finalized in a few seconds. However, some ledgers take up to a minute to close, though almost 99% of the ledgers are closed in less than 20 seconds. So then 99% percentile. So the performance is reasonably good. It's definitely much faster confirmation compared to Bitcoin. But of course, like, it's difficult to compare because Ripple is intended for a completely different purpose. Ripple is not effectively competing with Bitcoin. It's not a cryptocurrency in the same way. Well, it supports its own cryptocurrency. But it's mostly for transfers between banking institutions. So this is the overview of Ripple. And again, there are many details in which I'm not going. Now, let's proceed to the second system, which is Corda. In one of the first lectures, I was talking about the advantages of using blockchain, and I said that essentially that's one of the generally perceived advantages of blockchain is to enable parties who do not fully trust each other to form and maintain consensus about the existence, status, and evolution of a set of shared facts. So that's true about blockchain in general, but originally it was penned by I believe, Richard Brown, who is behind Corda. So how does it work in Corda? So the way it's implemented, I mean, the paradigm in Corda is very, very different from any other blockchain system we've seen so far. There is no sequential ledger. There is no even like some DAG, directed acyclic graph of transactions. Instead, there is a collection of facts. So each circle that you see here is a fact. And the fact could be shared not necessarily between everyone, every participant in the system. For each fact, there could be a different set of nodes sharing that fact. So you could see that, for example, these two facts are overlapping, which means that the set of nodes sharing these facts are overlapping. And here you see some nodes would be privy to all three facts. But in general, facts are confidential, so and encrypted, and they are like protected, so by access control. So, what are examples of shared facts? Two banks may agree that one bank owes certain amount of funds to the second bank, and that this amount needs to be repayable on demand. Another example, that this is a cash demand deposit. Two banks may agree that they are parties to some credit default swap. Two parties may agree to sign a contract. So contracts also play a very important role in Corda, but it's a different concept. It's similar in the sense that instead of the legal contract with the intermediary, we have an electronic contract, which is stored on the chain. That is similar. But of course, all the execution of the contracts, that is totally different in Corda. Because the contract is just attached to a particular fact. So the whole storage in Corda is a collection of facts. Now, those facts are I'm going to talk about it a bit soon. The facts are also cryptographically secured, so in that sense it's similar to blockchain, but the way it's done is different. Okay, but two banks agree that Bank A is obliged to deliver something within 3 days in exchange for a cash payment. So all kinds of financial agreements are represented as facts in Corda. And the whole system is intended, so the system is mostly intended not for individual users, but for financial institutions. Well, of course, individual users can also be part of the system. It's like a peer-to-peer network of financial institutions who do not necessarily fully trust each other. So what's the similar? Let's place Corda in comparison to other blockchain systems. How is it similar? It's similar because there is no centralized party controlling the workflow. There is no one organization which would control the storage of all the facts. Instead of it's a peer-to-peer system. It's similar because it uses cryptographic primitive to ensure immutability of facts. Though the facts is, well, it's a bit similar to ledger, to the sequential ledger, in the sense that the facts cannot be easily tampered with. And the facts may have some complicated dependencies, in which case a later fact would be cryptographically linked to the previous fact. And that also gives extra immutability protection for the facts. It's similar in the sense that validity of transactions is being checked, but of course it can only be checked within the validators who get access to a particular fact. And usually it's a small number of validators. It's similar in the sense that there is an agreement protocol. Before the contract, before the fact is getting signed, there is a consensus protocol on the fact. It's similar in the sense that there is a conflict resolution here. There is no branching in Corda, but could be some disputes between the participants, and those disputes need to be resolved, and there is an additional mechanism for resolving the disputes on the facts. Similarly to Hyperledger, it uses a permission peer-to-peer network between the participants. And the transactions are generic, so they're not necessarily financial. It's not only transfers. The facts can be anything. However, it also has significant differences compared to other blockchains. So no global sharing of data. Only parties with legitimate need to know can see the data within an agreement. So it's on the need to know basis. There are no blocks, and consequently no sequence of blocks. And the consensus between participating organizations at the level of individual deals. So it's not a global level of the system. It's not like a order in Fabric which orders all transactions, even maybe within a given channel, but still all transactions within the channel. Here, like, the scale of consensus is much smaller. There is provision in the Corda design to enable supervisory observer nodes, which would be allowed to observe the compliance of financial transactions with the regulations. So the design of Corda is aware of specific regulations like Know Your Customer and similar, and would support those regulations. So how consensus is achieved? It's achieved at the level of individual deals, but what's the mechanism? So Corda supports a variety of consensus mechanisms at a small scale. However, most of those mechanisms, again, based on Byzantine fault tolerance between a small number of participants. Corda records an explicit link between human language legal prose documents and smart contract code. And in fact, well, it's not specific to Corda, but one of the very promising research directions is how to take legal document from lawyers and do automatic translation of the legal prose in the document to the executable code and create a contract based on the legal prose. So that's generally one of the important areas of research. And Corda plays significant role for this direction because it has an emphasis on the legal documents. And by itself, Corda has no native cryptocurrency. The transactions, the agreements about the facts could be not necessarily financial, well, usually they are, but those financial agreements, they usually transactions in real currency, in fiat, not in cryptocurrency. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not even sure, like, I don't know why it's so blurred. It's not on my screen. So I guess it's very difficult to see what's in the picture. But the picture is supposed to illustrate several aspects, right? So essentially it shows how agreements are stored. So these two institutions are partners to the agreement, and then in agreement, all this has some embedded reference to the contract code, and also embedded reference to the legal prose. So an agreement usually includes reference both to the legal documents and to the programmatic contract. So, and the two are connected together. That link is very important for Corda. And yeah, so that the content of the contract can be anything, right? So it's illustrated here, but it's not so important. Of course, Corda also places significant emphasis on reusability of code and reusability of smart contracts. So developed once, but used for many. So it's pretty much standardized because most of the applications for Corda serving similar purpose of financial agreements, right? So both the legal prose may be standardized. There is a library of legal prose, and there is a library of programmatic contracts. Yep. So this is the end of this lecture that covered Ripple and Corda. I would like to thank you and welcome. Questions are welcome.